Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the fish and wildlife management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gerken. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing. Welcome back to Fins, Fur, and Feathers. This week we've got an aquatics episode, and Joe, you want to talk about ducks, huh?
Yeah, I'm starting to get excited and getting a little bit cooler weather outside and starting to get me excited about climbing into a duck stand or a duck blind. Not sure I'm excited to wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning, but excited to get out there and watch some sunrises, I guess. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about some waterfowl today.
That's good. I've been hearing whistling wings fly overhead when I've been doing other things, and it's got me thinking about ducks too. But I'm not the kind of person that goes out and puts a bunch of effort into hunting ducks. I work too hard at other things, so I just walk over the pond dam and shoot them when they flush.
Well, that works too. Nothing wrong with that. I act like I get up at 3 or 4, and I don't. I'm a lazy hunter. It goes out a little bit later in the morning and still finds a few. So
yeah.
But today we're going to talk about, just some ducks we see in Kansas, what kind of species we see. There's actually 27 different species that have been documented in Kansas. About 14 of those are known to nest in Kansas. So a lot of them we see, they're just flying by, flying overhead or on their migration pattern. And so, we tend to see those 14 species that are nesting here. Most of the ducks we see are going to be in 3 main species. So we're going to see a lot of mallards. We're going to see a lot of blue-winged teal, and we're going to see a lot of wood ducks. And so those are the 3 main ones that we see, but there's a lot of diversity. So getting out there to a pond, lots of different ducks that you can see.
Sure. Are there like groups of ducks that we can think about when we're trying to identify them?
Yeah. I remember the day that I learned about diving ducks and dabbling ducks. It's fun when you're going, learning things throughout life.
Sure.
And something kind of sticks with you. But I remember learning that there were different groups of ducks. And so there's the way that they feed. They're kind of differentiated into diving ducks or dabbling ducks. And so diving ducks, I bet you can figure this one out. They dive. Good job. So they tend to dive down. They have some body adaptations. They generally have a little bit more streamlined body. Their legs are moved a little bit further back on their body, and they have a little bit stronger legs. So they can dive underwater, stay underwater for a few minutes looking for food, and then pop back up at the surface. And so if we think about ducks like scaup, so greater scaup or lesser scaup, or there's a lot of ringneck ducks, buffleheads around here. So lots of different species. If you're watching them out on your pond and they seem to just disappear under the water for a few minutes and pop back up, those are diving ducks.
Sure.
Those ducks have a little bit different adaptation to help them be more powerful swimmers, and we tend to see changes in their diet related to that. So they're going to be chasing after some fish. Mergansers eat a lot of fish, for example, small little fish that are going to be slower in some of those colder waters. But they're going to be diving down, eating fish, eating invertebrates, lots of different macroinvertebrates, bugs that we see in the water itself. They'll eat some vegetation, but they're going to be eating more of that fish and invertebrate side of things. The other group of ducks are dabbling ducks. And dabbling ducks, you'll see them out in the water at column, and they just kind of tip up, and they put their head underwater and their butts up in the air, and they'll just kind of spin around a little bit with their heads down, dabbling around, I guess would be the term that you use there.
Yeah.
Grabbing some food off the bottom. Their legs tend to be a little bit more centered. They look a little more balanced. They tend to have a little bit more wider body. And so a duck like a mallard or a teal would be an example of dabbling ducks that are going to be eating. In that dabbling method, they're going to eat a lot more vegetation. And
Sure.
So just kind of putting their heads down, grabbing some stuff and eating. So those are the 2 main groups that we'd see, diving ducks or dabbling ducks, based on their behavior and what they're eating.
Do we see those different species segregated all based on like where they're going to be at in the body of water, or based on maybe water depth or anything like
Sure.
that?
Yeah. So the dabbling ducks, it'd be pretty hard to tip upside down as a duck and hit the bottom if you're in really deep water.
Have to have a long neck.
You'd have to have a really long neck. Yeah. Giraffe duck. That's not something that we see. But yeah, getting in the shallower type habitats is where you tend to see dabbling ducks, and then out in more open water, deeper habitats is where you tend to see those divers. shores. That doesn't mean you're only going to see them there, right?
Sure.
You can see mallards out in the middle of a big pond or a big lake, and you can see some of those diving species in shallow wetland habitats too. But tends to be that the dabblers like shallower habitats and the divers like the deeper habitats.
Yeah, definitely. I think, one of the things when I'm teaching folks for managing habitat, and I'm probably getting farther ahead than you want to be right now, but when we think about habitat for dabbling ducks, somewhere between 2 and 10 inches of water is about as deep as they want it to be if they're feeding. So.
Yep. Yeah, they want it to be really shallow, lots of vegetation in that area. So they tend to like those wetlands quite a bit more than they like the big open areas.
So these ducks, are they going to be around year-round, or are we looking for them during different times of the year? What are we thinking here?
We got some of both of those, and so there are some species that are year-round residents. We see that really commonly with Canada geese, and so we see residents that stick around all year long, and we see other groups of waterfowl that are migrating. And so the migrating groups, we tend to see two main times of migration. So we have fall migration. That's tend to be when we talk about migration, people generally are thinking about that fall migration. Are they pushing down? Are there ducks out on the wetlands that I can go hunt type of deal? When are they coming through? We think about teal, smaller bodied ducks moving through, earlier in Kansas, maybe early September, and some of the bigger ducks moving down, in October or November.
Yeah.
That's largely due to the photo period, so the amount of sunlight, not necessarily weather conditions. But Kansas is located in the Central Flyway, and so there are a bunch of different ducks that are up in different portions of Canada or in the northern states, so North Dakota, South Dakota, and they're going to migrate down to their winter habitats, and they're going to stop in Kansas along the way, along that flight pattern down. Like I said, generally that migration is initiated by photo period. That's not to say, if we have a really cold spell, a lot of water freezes over, they're not going to have a place to hang out. They might push out because of that, but for the most part, it doesn't matter if it's hot or cold, what the exact temperatures are. It matters more that photo period that's kind of driving them down. We see the opposite of that in the springs. And so in springtime, those ducks that have migrated south are now going to go back up north to their breeding habitats. That's usually a faster migration. So the theory out there is that they're trying to get up north, and there's some sort of evolutionary adaptation that the ones that get there sooner are going to have the better nesting ground, and so they don't make as many stops. Their flight speed, their ground speed is all faster going up north, and so just kind of a cool little differentiation there. So having habitats during these two migrations where species can kind of stop, get rest, fill up on food or water if they need to, is really important. And so that's when we'll see a lot of these different species in Kansas during that migration time.
Is the food resources or the water needs that they have, are they different in the fall versus the spring?
Yeah, so when they're flying up north, they're getting ready to lay eggs, and so they're going to need more calcium, for example, right? And so they're going to eat more mussels, they're going to eat more invertebrates, having access to kind of some more of those nutrient-rich meals as they're flying up north to prepare them for breeding seasons. We definitely see a difference there.
That makes sense. So if we think about the ones that are the waterfowl species that are going to be around here year-round, what's driving that?
Yeah, making sure that they have the right habitat, right? And so the habitat that's available, Canada geese are a group, and you might know more about this than I do, but they're a group that there's really are two different populations, and their habitat use is quite different. So resident Canada geese tend to enjoy open green spaces, and migratory species tend to prefer, or migratory groups tend to prefer more of a wetland type habitat. And so seeing some of those differences, making sure that they have access to food, that they have access to cover, that they feel safe is really important. One of the other important things for when they're year-round is that they have the right type of nesting habitat. And so when we think about nesting, most of us, even my brain jumps to they must be in a pond or in a body of water, right? And a lot of these species actually can go, a mile or two away from the closest water and out into some sort of grassland. And so thinking about a mallard laying a nest in in an open upland habitat type area, it doesn't seem like it should work, but that's where they're going, right?
Yeah.
And so dabbling ducks tend to go find habitats that are near grasslands and upland areas. Research has shown that areas that have better upland habitat, large patches tend to have less predation than smaller patches that are less cover. That makes sense, right? So they're a little more out in the open, higher predation rates. Diving ducks tend to make little nest rafts, is one of the terms for them. Take a bunch of vegetation and find a shallow area on some sort of wetland and kind of make a little nest there. And so these aren't really complicated nests most of the time. There's a little bit of vegetation just to make a little indentation. And then, the bird kind of lays their eggs and broods in that area. So not really a complicated nest like we think about. And some of these species are going to have nests in both of those areas. So mallards are a good example of that. They can nest in grassland habitats, and they can nest in open water areas, right? And so that's kind of a neat overlap there where they can do both. Some of the research has shown that the mallards that nest in areas near water have higher nest success, but there's a caveat to that. So a duck called a redhead, which is a common diving species that you might see, is a nest parasite or a brood parasite. So it will go lay its eggs in nests of other species, a lot like a brown-headed cowbird might do, right? So we may have heard about those, that similar situation there. But these redheads can go lay their eggs, and the eggs generally hatch a day or two earlier than the mallards. And they can then outcompete with the mallards. So they might be growing more redheads, raising more redheads than they are mallard offspring. And so in general, it's thought that mallards that are having their nests in upland habitats tend to do a little bit better for the population than the ones on these floating rafts. But just cool to think about when we're thinking about nesting habitat, the diversity of habitat that can fulfill that need.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we talk about a lot when we're thinking about waterfowl production is, well, how much grassland is there in the prairie pothole region?
Yeah.
Or on the flip side of that, if we've lost a bunch of grassland because, let's say, CRP, the value that producers are getting paid for the rental rate on their grassland that they have replanted out in the croplands, where there are ephemeral wetlands out in the prairie pothole region, when that CRP doesn't have much value and those contracts that expire aren't re-enrolled, then we lose a lot of nesting cover for those species, the dabbling duck species specifically that you mentioned, and that can have a big impact on them. And thinking about prairie affecting ducks, it just seems weird. But
yeah, it doesn't seem like it should go together, but it is really important, right?
Yeah.
And so that loss of that cover, loss of that grassland habitat is something really important to consider. I think it's a lot like how we think about managing a pond, right? When we think about managing a pond, I do this every day, and the first thing my brain jumps to is, how do I manage that pond, that exact pond, right? And a lot of times it can be something that's going on a mile away that has the most impact on that pond. But it always takes me a few seconds to remember that before I step back and say, hey, what's going on? And the same thing could be true with these waterfowl species, right? Especially in these dabbling ducks. Taking a step back and realizing it's not just what we're doing at the pond, it's what we're doing throughout the entire landscape that can impact their populations. It's an interesting way to think about things and fun to have kind of that broader view.
Yeah, not even the landscape scale, but even a flyway scale.
Yeah.
Like what they're doing in North Dakota affects what ducks are going to be available in Texas.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? Yeah, that's very true.
So you kind of led into this, or we led into it a little bit. But if we're thinking about hunting, how many ducks are harvested? How important is duck hunting and those sorts of things?
Yeah, I mean, there's entire groups of individuals that live just for duck hunting, right? And so it has a huge economic impact. There's around 11 to 12 million ducks that are harvested in the United States each year. That's down from about 20 million in the 70s, and so we've dropped quite a bit, roughly in half. There's about 250,000 ducks harvested in Kansas each year, and so that varies, give or take 50,000, but that's kind of where we're at, and still a large number that's being harvested, but down quite a bit from where it used to be, and we're seeing those numbers drop again, because of habitat loss, population declines, and I think overall just fewer hunters getting out there, but still quite a few that are going out and harvesting these animals.
Yeah, waterfowl tends to be one of the really popular species, not just for hunters, but also people who want to watch wildlife, right?
Yeah, that's true. So another area there, we talk about harvesting them. There's a huge group that just wants to go out and observe them. And so thinking about Cheyenne Bottoms is a huge wildlife refuge that we have in Kansas, that individuals literally come from all over the world to go to this one area and observe the diversity of different types of wildlife that we have there. So great conservation effort, great that there are hunters contributing to that conservation as well. And so just lots of opportunities to get out and enjoy these animals.
Yeah. Ducks are a great example of how hunters contribute to conservation, through purchasing duck stamps, purchasing hunting licenses, purchasing state duck stamps in addition to the federal duck stamp, and then also all the contributions to Ducks Unlimited and the nonprofit organizations that pump money back into refuges like Cheyenne Bottoms. That's, like you said, it's important. There's people that come from all over the world to watch waterfowl and shorebirds there, but it's also a wetland of international importance.
Yeah.
So, birds that start their migration path in South America stop over there on their way to the Arctic Circle. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's definitely really cool. Lots of opportunities there to see individuals or see species that you might not be able to see other places on a regular basis.
What's the most popular duck to hunt, you think, Joe?
Well, I think it's probably a greenhead, probably a mallard is what most people are after, right?
Yeah.
I don't know that's what everyone's after. I like to go after teal. I think watching those little airplanes flying is fun, but I'd have to think it's a mallard.
Yeah, I think that's the species that you hear the most people talk about for
Yeah.
sure. But it sure doesn't bother me a bit when it gets to just be mostly gadwalls around and they're hanging out on ponds, because that's a fun species for me to go hunt when I don't like to do all the effort of putting out decoys and all those sorts of things.
That's the first duck I ever harvested was a gadwall. They got a little special place in my heart. I love seeing gadwall. I love hearing that almost honking sound that they make. They're fun to be around for sure.
So we've kind of talked a little bit about the things that people enjoy about ducks, seeing them, hunting them, and that sort of thing. What about problems that waterfowl might cause for people?
Sure, I think the biggest one is probably their fecal matter, and so if we get large groups of ducks that are walking around, HOAs call me quite often because they have a green space and it's just overrun by Canada geese, and people don't want to walk their dogs amongst all the droppings. And so that's probably the biggest one that I get. They're just in areas where they're in high densities, they're spending time on land, and we don't want to walk around the messiness. And so that's probably the biggest thing I see. You get called for human-wildlife conflict a lot. You see other questions other than that?
Well, it tends to be geese that I get called the most about. I can't remember when the last time I had a call about a problem duck was, but like you said, the resident Canada geese hanging out in green space, they also will oftentimes nest in pots and flower beds and those sorts of things right at the entrance to a building.
Yep.
And when we've got a nesting pair of Canada geese, they get a little bit aggressive when people start encroaching on that nest. And so, we might have a goose that chases somebody or nips at them, and then we have to figure out what to do about that sort of conflict as well.
I know we're kind of laughing about that too, but those geese are really aggressive.
Sure.
When a mama goose does not like you near her eggs or a gosling, so she looks like she could do a lot of harm when she's yelling at you and honking at you. So definitely something, if you're not around wildlife every day especially, that could be alarming. So definitely an issue for sure.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I hear the most about is, during spring migration, when we get really big flocks of especially snow geese, and then maybe we get a cold front that is just sort of stopping right north of us. And so we've got these snow geese that are hanging out for a long time, and it's been wet. And so we've got muddy wheat fields, and then we have snow geese out there trampling that wheat down, and we can see some damage there too. But definitely the geese is where where we get the most problems there.
Yeah, and so, I mean, there are a few things we can do. I mean, I know going out and oiling eggs is a common thing. We start to see those, and that's literally just taking oil and rubbing it on the eggs, and it blocks the pores of the eggs from being able to exchange gases and asphyxiates the developing embryos. And, you can, in some cases, get some depredation permits. I know there's some other things that are commonly done. What other advice would you have for folks in that situation?
Well, the egg oiling is the most common practice, and in urban areas, we do have some wildlife control folks who have that process of getting those permits down pat, and that sounds pretty cruel to a lot of people. Probably the real benefit of egg oiling when we have these geese that are nesting in flower beds and nesting close to the entrance to a business is that the geese will continue to attend that nest long enough that by the time they realize those eggs aren't going to hatch, they won't re-nest. And if we instead were to go in and just remove the eggs, they would re-nest. And so the problem persists longer than it does otherwise when we either oil the eggs or addle them. Addle them is another thing that's done to the eggs to reduce their hatchability. Basically, it's just shaking them up and scramble them inside the shell. The other things that we can do, there is a fertility control product called Ovocon. It's labeled for Canada geese in some states. The last time I checked, it wasn't labeled in Kansas, I don't think. But it's basically a fertility control chemical that while the geese are eating feed that has this, I think it's nicarbazin. I think that's right from the top of my head.
I'll take your word for it.
But while they're eating that chemical, it drastically reduces the hatchability of the eggs. One of the real benefits of that specific product is when the geese quit eating it, it no longer affects their fertility. So if they move on and they nest somewhere else, then we're not affecting their reproduction, let's say next year. There's a lot of site fidelity in these geese, meaning they come back to nest at the same place year after year, and the chicks are going to tend to come back to the places where they were hatched in order to nest. And so if we can reduce the number of geese that are hatched and then fledged, let's say at a golf course pond, this year, then we can potentially reduce the number of geese that are going to come back to that spot next year. So that's the value of like the fertility control type drugs in golf courses, really specifically golf courses, but other turf grass situations where we have lots of geese hanging out that are intensively managed. The use of herding dogs has become fairly common. So there are folks who train like Border Collie, Australian Shepherd, those breeds of dogs, they'll train them to chase geese. And sometimes they'll train them just to hang out in the shade, sort of out of sight, out of mind, so that they're not bothering the golfers. But then when the geese show up, they know to run out there and chase the geese. Other dogs would be trained so that they're just going to ride around with golf course managers and that sort of thing. And when they see the geese, the golf course manager sicks them on them and they chase them off. There's also some different lights. Motion activated stuff is the best because the geese tend not to get habituated to them. They don't get used to it and figure out it's not a challenge. We can also see that hunting can be a good way to reduce populations of these birds. We're not hunting in the city where the problem is. We're hunting close by where they're feeding in fields when they leave the city. And so that's one of the reasons that we've seen the dark goose seasons in a lot of states extend pretty early into the fall, because those early seasons target those resident Canada geese, but the migrating segment of the population isn't there yet. So that allows us to try and reduce those local birds.
Yeah. One of the things that one of our listeners brought up was that, hey, these birds are endangered, which isn't correct, but he said they're endangered, so why are they still protected, right? And so keeping in mind that they're not endangered, but there's a lot of them, right? And so why are they still protected?
Well, the big challenge with geese is figuring out which ones are migrators and which ones are residents, right? And if if a species crosses state lines as part of its normal activities through something like a migration, so that species in generally crosses several state lines and maybe even international borders going from the United States to Mexico or the U.S. to Canada and so on, then they are covered by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And so that makes them a federally managed species. And so, we talked about this a little bit with turkey vultures, but these birds that are a national or an international species, the regulations over harvest, the regulations over how many can be killed, when they can be killed, and all those sorts of things are broadly set by the federal government. And then states can be more restrictive, but they can't be less restrictive for most of those species. And so because we have migrating geese, because you can't really tell which ones are migrants and which ones are residents unless it's just a time of year distinction, then that's why they're not, it's just not willy-nilly kill as many of them as you want to.
Sure. Yeah, we need to be able to protect those migratory groups.
Yeah.
And so without being able to tell them apart, we see that quite often too. There's sturgeon are a good example in the Kansas River, where a pallid sturgeon is a federally endangered sturgeon. There's also a similar looking sturgeon called a shovel-nosed sturgeon. And to most people, if you picked them both up, you weren't a fisheries biologist, they'd look very similar. And so in order to protect one species, we're kind of putting some regulations on others. And that's kind of what that Migratory Bird Act is doing, is just saying, hey, we want to protect this larger group. Right?
Yeah.
One of the things that people often come up to me about is with waterfowl, and a concern for it is eutrophication. And so we've talked about that big word. That just means there's too many nutrients in a water body, right? And that can lead to issues like excessive plant growth and stinky water, low oxygen levels. And so it's not always great. A lot of times people see ducks hanging out or geese hanging out around a pond, and they get worried about that. And that is very, very rare. It would take a very large number of geese staying at an area for a really long period of time to add enough nutrients and the right type of nutrients that could lead to eutrophication. I have seen it happen a couple times, but most of the time that's a concern that's just not valid. And I like to point out to people, waterfowl and Mother Nature ponds have coexisted for a really long time.
Sure.
And so those systems are really well adapted to working with the amount of nutrients. And usually there's some other source that's causing the input of nutrients, putting it over the edge. Now, I will say, if you already have a problem with eutrophication and you add a large population of geese, then you can see the problem potentially exacerbated. So there are some concerns there, but for the most part, eutrophication, too many nutrients, the birds just aren't capable of adding enough for it to be the sole or primary driver of a lot of that change.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Kind of going back to what we were talking about with harvest and maybe a species crossing international borders and all that kind of stuff. The overall population of Canada geese is not at a level where they're causing a problem, right? But a different example would be with snow geese. Mm-hmm. So snow geese are a species that crosses many different borders, federal, state, and those sorts of things. But they are actually, and have been for quite some time, causing ecological damage in their breeding grounds up in the Arctic Circle, right? And so because of that, we have very, very liberal harvest allowed during that spring season. So no plugs in your gun. Of course, we have plugs when we're hunting other waterfowl so that we can only have at a maximum 3 shells in there, but you can use electronic calls for snow geese. There's no limits on how many you can harvest and that sort of thing. And so that's kind of the opposite example. And of course, if Canada geese ever got to where there were so many of them, they had rebounded beyond some population that we wanted them to be at, and they were causing damage at a broad scale, then maybe we would see something like that.
Sure.
So.
Yeah, and those, we've mentioned light geese and dark geese a couple times. I think most of our listeners probably know what those are, but snow geese would be an example of light geese with that extended season, and Canada geese would be an example of a dark goose that have just that kind of that more typical wetland or more typical waterfowl season.
Yeah.
So, But interesting there. So, thinking about these different types of waterfowl, people ask me a lot, how do I get more ducks? So we just talked about getting rid of too many.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people out there that have a backyard pond and they want some ducks to be there. And so, thinking about how to get ducks there is always it's always fun because, there's nothing you can do if there aren't any ducks in the area.
Yeah.
But if they are there, one of the things is, leave them alone. So if you do see some ducks there, you see the goslings, they're really cute. People want to go take pictures and be by them. But if they don't feel safe in that habitat, if they think you're coming to catch them every time, they're not going to want to come back. And so encouraging them to nest, making sure that they have access to those nesting habitats we talked about earlier is really important. Enough food. And so when we talk about things like how much vegetation do I want in my pond? Do I want any vegetation? A lot of people think they don't, but if you want ducks, if you want wildlife, you want different species there, you're going to need to have some vegetation there, something for them to eat. So the amount there that they have, talking about feeding, it is illegal to bait ducks to hunt them, right? And so we can't go throw out a pile of food to hunt them on, but I think that we can encourage food in that area, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Do you know anything about that?
Yeah. So, one of the important things to remember is that, just placing a pile of food out is not habitat management.
Yeah.
So we can absolutely manage habitat. We just can't put an artificial food source out there
Right.
to attract ducks and geese and other migratory birds like doves. So if we think about what's allowed, normal agricultural practices would be allowed. And that's
Sounds like some fancy jargon.
Yeah, that's pretty broad, but that's what's included in the regulations that are put forth by the federal government about these species. And so included under normal agricultural practices would be most of what we would do is a normal habitat management. So if you want to encourage vegetation around your pond, most ponds that follow pond construction guidelines are really bad for managing for waterfowl. And that's because if you've got that 3-to-1 slope, it's hard to grow vegetation around the edge. So one of the really common things that folks do, whether they're managing a pond or another kind of wetland for waterfowl, is to draw the water down. So we would draw the water down at some point either just before or during the growing season, so in the spring or early summer, and then that allows a whole bunch of vegetation to go ahead and sprout, right, and start growing. And one of the advantages to managing that way is that we can sort of drive what sorts of plants are going to sprout out there based on when we draw it down, how slowly we draw it down, and all those sorts of things. So barnyard grass might be a species that you would see a lot of in Kansas when we're using that sort of management. It's something that people are striving for, and that's just wild millet. So that's something that we can manage for. That would be what we would consider a moist soil type management. So we're using water level manipulation and the natural vegetation that goes ahead and responds to that drying up to sprout, come up, and provide cover and food. After that stuff comes up, you can do additional management to it. You can mow some of it if you want to. You could disc some of it, and we wouldn't do that on the edge of a pond. But if we had a larger wetland system, maybe you have 20 acres, and in that 20 acres, you've got 10 acres that when everything comes up, you have about half barnyard grass and half smartweed. Well, that's a pretty good patch to keep.
Yeah.
But the other piece that's not barnyard grass and smartweed, well, that ends up being cuckleburs. Okay, so we could go out there and we could use disking to kill those cuckleburs and let something else come up behind it. Or we could spray it with a herbicide. Or we could mow off that stuff and have that be open water after it gets flooded again. We could, in a crop field, we could plant a crop and then we could intentionally flood that crop, or we could allow that crop to flood naturally. by having a water control structure that we just, put some stops back into, and that then floods it. You could, before you flooded it, you could do some normal agricultural management, like disking part of that crop back down, or even mowing part of that crop back down. That's why on a wildlife area, a lot of times they'll plant sunflowers and then go in there and mow them. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people think, well, that's baiting. No, that's actually included as a normal agricultural practice. So those are some of the things that we can do to manage for food and cover at the same time that would be specific to what might be in the water, but independent of those broader landscape level management practices that you were talking about, like promoting native grassland and that sort of thing.
Yeah, a lot of that's news to me too, and interesting to think about how you can manipulate that, and that might be different depending on if we're targeting dabbling ducks or targeting those diving ducks we talked about too, right? One of the things that's going to happen if we draw down that water and then flood it back in is that water clarity is probably going to decrease, and so thinking about things like natural plant growth of aquatic species, not those terrestrial ones that we're talking about, but we might see decreases in the amount of aquatic plants or a different type of invertebrates. And so having a plan where you kind of think about all this is really, really interesting, and it's something that's kind of always adapting, right? I think that water clarity part is it's something that's undervalued. We talked about that in episode 26 recently, but I think that understanding the impacts of water clarity on everything and just kind of that management protocol, what are you targeting and how do you want to get there? There's lots of different ways to do it. Fun to think about.
Yeah, for sure. And depending on what you do, you're going to have a very different nutrient density out there. One of the things about drawing the water down is we tend to select against the perennial aquatic plants. Annual aquatic plants tend to produce more seed. We also see better invertebrate density in grass versus forbs if we're looking at those flooded plants out there. And so, drawing down and flooding in a way that promotes more grass cover versus more let's say smartweed as a broadleaf plant, we can get pretty creative that way. And so it goes way beyond thinking about just I'm going to go out and plant some corn and flood it.
Right.
If you really want to be a good waterfowl manager, and especially if you're thinking about holding late season ducks, that's when those invertebrates become really important, and that moist soil management can be good. So maybe someday we'll have an episode where we just talk about providing food and cover for ducks out in wetlands.
That's great. I think wetland habitats are so fascinating to me. They're really important, and we tend not to think about them all the time because they're not something that most people are going to interact with.
Sure.
So, fun to discuss there.
Yeah. So what about, thinking about the long-term viability of these duck populations, having ducks that we can see in the future, take pictures of in the future, potentially hunt in the future, and all those sorts of things. So what are the major concerns and stuff we need to think about?
Yeah, I think thinking, on a large scale. And so like I mentioned earlier, we tend to think about a pond or a wildlife management area or something, but these individuals in a lot of cases are migrating, up to Canada, down to Mexico, covering a really large area. And so practices that are happening throughout that whole range can really, really impact their populations. I think changing agricultural practices, thinking about going from small pockets to really large areas where we're getting rid of some of those little prairie potholes, for example, little bodies of water where these waterfowl may have been able to stop at. Aging reservoirs, which are filling in a lot of the habitats that these ducks and geese used to utilize, is always changing. But thinking about a plan that incorporates some aspects of habitat management that provides the right amount of food, right amount of cover, the right amount of nesting habitat, which includes that grassland. I think that is just something that surprises a lot of people, right? All of that kind of goes together, making sure that we're thinking about long-term and broad-scale management techniques that can really help these species.
Yeah. Well, that's one reason it's good that we have the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, right?
Yeah.
'Cause we can't do a lot to manage for a lot of these species of ducks here in Kansas that's going to affect what we'll have next year. We can just affect what we've got right now, what we can hold.
Yep. So having those big, broad acts that are protecting wildlife can be really important.
Yeah. Well, Joe, thank you for bringing this topic to us. I enjoyed talking about ducks and duck habitat with you.
Yeah, fun conversation.
Good. Well, all of our listeners out there, we want to thank you for listening. Like we always say, please like, subscribe, leave us a review if you can. Check us out on YouTube if you haven't seen us there yet. We're starting to get a lot more views there than I
Probably
ever
your pretty
expected
face,
we would.
Drew.
I doubt it. People don't want to look at me. But again, thanks everybody for listening, and we will talk to you again in a couple of weeks with a terrestrial episode.
Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.